Hey everyone, Ed Bazaar here. It's my privilege to welcome the great Mr. Steve Rosen today, a renowned music journalist and author with over 4 decades of experience writing for top publications like Guitar Player, Guitar World, and Rolling Stone. Steve has a deep connection to the rock music world. Today he joins me to discuss his new Eddie Van Halen book, Tonechaser. This book offers a personal and insightful look at the legendary Eddie Van Halen, based on Steve's long-standing friendship with him and packed with unreleased Eddie Van Halen interviews plus much, much more. There's not going to be any introductions in this interview. Let's get straight into it. That's really amazing. So just briefly, can you give us, I know like your storied background, but can you please give us a brief overview of your career and what you've achieved from beginning till now, please?
Sure. Capsule version. I actually began writing for my high school newspaper. I had like the first music column at Culver City High School. So I'd go out to clubs and review shows. I loved that. I loved doing that. The next day, my little article would be in the paper with my name, and people who had never talked to me before would come up to me and go, "Oh, you went into the whiskey. That's cool." So I thought, there's something here. There's something here to being a writer with your name in a magazine. It carries some gravitas with it. I went on to write for some local papers, actually like little throwaways, they would kind of toss onto your porch. I would do like little album reviews. I went to UCLA, a university here, and took some English courses. I thought I would, try to sharpen my skills, and that was a disaster. I hated it. I hated the English teacher. It was a waste. Following that, this is like 72. I started, kind of freelancing in earnest a little more. I would go to a show and write type up like a little live review, and I would send it out to all the.
Sorry, Steve. Can I stop you there? Just quickly,
Sure.
So when you were talking about the teacher you didn't like, because I heard this on Tonechaser, just please, can you give us a bit of, because what you had to go through, a bit of adversity there, wasn't there? Like, what did you have to overcome to get past this guy, this lame teacher?
Yeah.
It didn't benefit you at all.
No.
What did you have to overcome to get past that negativity to be at where you will to achieve what you achieved?
Gotcha. Well, I'll tell you, man. I sort of make a little bit light of it in the book, but it was actually pretty hard. I thought I was a pretty good writer coming into UCLA, and I would write these papers, and there would be like F or a D minus with these long, nasty, comments. It's like, the F wasn't enough. This guy, man, I truly believe, I don't know what it was. He just didn't like me, man. He wanted to dig deeper, and it just kept happening over and over. And I remember him taking me aside, and again, I think it may have been in front of the entire class, and go, man, your attitude is really bad. You think you're a much better writer than you are. You are never going to make it as a writer, and you really shouldn't try. So that hurt. I mean, that really hurt, So I quit school that year. I don't even know if I finished out the year at UCLA. The only good time I had at UCLA, I took a classical guitar class, and I love that, man. I was really good at that. And why I didn't sort of actually become a music, pursue music as a major, I don't know. But so I quit, and that was hard, But you're young, right? Youth is stupid. Youth is obstinate, and so I went out there and I go, I'm going to prove this guy wrong. So that's when as I mentioned, I went out and tried to become a journalist in earnest. And so I would review shows. I would send out reviews, and I was being rejected by everybody. I remember sending a review to Rolling Stone. There was a magazine called Cream and Circus, and they all rejected it, And I thought, okay, keep writing. And then I finally got something printed in a local. It was like an underground newspaper kind of a radical newspaper called the Los Angeles Free Press, but they had an amazing music section. They did all these amazing reviews and these features. And I remember, I think, I can't even remember if they said they were going to use this review. I remember picking up an issue because I used to read it every week, and I'm thumbing through it, and I look, and I go, oh my God, that's that review I did of that KGB. That was the name of the radio station, put on this show in San Diego, just about 100 miles south of where I was living. And I did a review, and they printed it. So this is like where you like open up like one of those compartments, you know, you put in a quarter and pull out a newspaper. Well, I put in a quarter and I took every newspaper in there, man. I took like 20 of them, you know, and it was just that feeling, man, was just so amazing. And from there it grew. So now I use that as kind of a calling card. So now I recontacted Cream and Circus and said, hey, look, I had this printed in the Free Press. Um, Peter Frampton is coming to town. I'd love to, interview him for the magazine. And that's how it happens. You know, you kind of build on that. And ultimately, I wrote for every magazine that rejected me: Cream, Circus, Rolling Stone, Musician, um, Circus Raves. I mean, there were a lot of magazines back in the day. I started writing for Guitar Player in '73, and I became like their golden boy. And they just loved what I did. The first story I ever sent to them became a cover, and that was Jeff Beck. So I wrote for them for about 7 years, 73 to 80. And in that time, I did 16 cover stories, which averaged out to like every 4 covers, one a month was my story. So I did Jeff Beck, I did Jimmy Page, John Entwistle, Joe Walsh, Ronnie Wood. I mean, really heavy stories. And that opened the way to a lot of other magazines. I began writing for Guitar World. That's where I would write those 3 cover stories on Edward, which sort of became kind of landmark stories. People reference those stories. In fact, to this day, they still reference it. I wrote a lot for European and Asian magazines, a lot of Japanese magazines, a lot of magazines in the UK, France and Germany and Italy. Wrote for magazines in Canada, Australian Musician, and it just grew. And that career lasted until about 4 or 5 years ago, and I just kind of slowly edged away from it. And then in 2020 is when I sat down to write the book. But that represented, I never counted them, but I bet you there's 2,000 interviews that I did, dating back to kind of mid 1973. So that kind of in a nutshell is it. I wrote 8 books along the way, including the most recent Tonechaser book. The first book I wrote was on Jeff Beck that came out in Japan. I wrote a book on Free and Bad Company, wrote a book on Prince, Bruce Springsteen, Black Sabbath, Randy Rhoads. I wrote a children's book, the history of rock in 30 pages. That was fun. But far and away the book and the writing that has meant the most to me has been the Tonechaser book. It's kind of like everything I learned, went into that book. It's the best writing I could have done, and it's like, fuck you, UCLA music teacher. Here you go, man. I can't write, so here you go. Where are your books? So
yeah. That's what I love to see. So because we all, I mean, whether you're an artist or just your average person, we all go through some adversity in life, and especially as musicians as well, like, to deal with flack from outsiders, or especially today with social media, like everyone's just nitpicking like every minute detail. It's difficult. Some don't cope, but just to have that hustle and to strive for your dreams, which is what you did, and you reap the benefits. So that's I love to hear those kinds of stories, and also for any new people that maybe not aware of who you are, just to see how legit you are, because you've earned what you've achieved as well. So Much respect, that's for sure. But
Well, man, I really appreciate that, man. And look, man, nothing in life, as you said, is easy. And yes, the internet and being able to record your songs, inexpensively, and now everybody's a musician, everybody's a writer, everybody's John Steinbeck, everybody's got a podcast, everybody's got a blog, yeah, man, it's easy to send out, warning shots at other people, with the anonymity of the web, and nobody knows who you are, um, but yeah, it really does come down to how much do you want it, and how much does it mean to you, and yeah, willing to walk through that, walk through the fire and come out the other side, and uh, yeah, make it happen, because nobody gives you anything. I mean, you meet people along the way, and I did, and I'm sure you have, who believe in what you do, and those people are invaluable. Again, I mentioned my friend Adam Roach, who's helped me immeasurably. You and I had trouble linking up. Was all my fault, because I don't even know how to freaking, Instagram Live. Dude, I have no idea what that means. So thank goodness for Adam Roach, who knew how to put all my files up on the Soundwise app and all that stuff. So you find those people, man, and you really keep them close. But it is hard. It is hard, But if you believe it, I believe that some degree of success will come to you. You may not be Van Halen, but I think you'll find some success and fulfillment.
yeah, some great words of motivation there from the great Steve Rosen. Now, your book, Tonechaser. So you've been working on it for a few years now, and it's sort of evolved for different versions of the hard copy. Now you've got the audio book. I mean, just this unreleased footage, dating back to '78 with Eddie Van Halen. I mean, look, now we've got IG Live, Instagram Live. We're on Skype at the moment. What lengths did you have to go through to record a phone call in 1978 with Eddie Van Halen? Please explain.
You won't even. I mean, it's, oh my God, it's so. I was a Luddite then. I'm even more so now, man. Oh God. Somewhere, and I wish I could remember where I even got them. I may have even found them. We used to have rummage sales at our house, my parents, and they would make their garage sort of the place where everybody could bring their boxes of clothes and old radios. And I really think that I may have found this cassette player in a box in the garage. This thing, when I got it, was horrible. It was like a GE, a General Electric or something. It didn't have a microphone. And somewhere I got a microphone, like the cheapest microphone I could find, and had like a little, it was like, I think it was an RCA adapter, so you would plug it in. This thing was so bad. I used that microphone and that cassette player, I want to say, maybe the first 10 years of my career. This thing was so bad. Oh my God. And then I would use the worst cassettes. I would buy 3 cassettes for $1 because I was such a moron. I think, oh, well, cassette's a cassette, And they used to come in a plastic bag, And I was so dumb. I would use every inch of tape on it. So if an interview was 25 minutes long and there was 5 minutes left, I'd use that 5 minutes for another interview. And then I would turn it over. And the tape was so bad, when I went back to play the side A, it would bleed through. And what would happen is, because I didn't label them correctly, I'd have part 1 of an interview with Kiss on tape 5, but part B would be on tape 18, and I wouldn't even know. I'd have to go look. So in answer to your question, it's 1978. I've got my cassette player and I've got the microphone. How do I record a phone conversation? You have no idea what I went through. I don't know how to do it, man. I thought maybe there was something that I plugged into the microphone, into the telephone, literally. I'm looking around, maybe there's some jack or something. Maybe somebody told me it was this thing on one end is that same RCA jack, but on the other end is like this suction cup thing, and you would lick it, and you'd put the suction cup on. This is an old time telephone, right? This is a rotary telephone, right? No cell phones. So you lift it up and you exactly. So literally this suction cup, which is like the microphone, you would stick it on to the part where his voice is coming through the other end, and the other end was like an RCA jack. So it became like a de facto microphone. I don't even know how I figured it out. I didn't even know that it was if it was going to work. I did one. I go, oh, it works. So yes, that's what I recorded that first Van Halen interview with. That's why the quality, when you hear it, not so great. But I think part of the beauty of it and the uniqueness of it and the being in the moment is the fact that yes, this is what it was. So yeah, man, I used this thing. Honestly, I want to say for like the first 10 years, a buddy of mine worked at Sony and he got me a deal on a Sony Pro Walkman. So I started using that. But even that, it was great. It actually had a stereo mic, but I'd always sit too far away, or it would be, or I'd have the volume on the recording turned down. Even then, it was luck if something turned out correctly. So you listen to the audio book, man. Some of this stuff sounds really good. Some of it's a little tough to hear. But if you have the hardback, you can sort of use the hardback. That now becomes a script. And Edward's talking. And what did he say? Oh, Edward's talking, So that was it. Yeah, man. But I was bad. And I cringe now. And I think, God, why didn't I know better? But the truth of it is, Ed, is back in the day, when I recorded those interviews, they were never meant to be heard by anyone else. They were I only recorded them because I would then listen to them, transcribe them, and write a story. So no one was ever going to hear them but me. So the quality never really mattered, so long as it was adequate enough for me to transcribe and understand what he was saying. Right? So then, the internet comes along and now audio is king. And it's like, oh my God, who would have thought that the audio was going to have value all these years later? So, but at least I did keep all the tapes. I eventually had a buddy dump all the cassettes to CDs, and then I actually had them dumped to hard drives. So it only took me about 35 years to wise up and get it. But at least I did keep those cassettes, and thank goodness. They all remained intact. None of them broke. As I'm playing them, I'm saying, please don't break, and so yeah, thank goodness for small favors.
That's great. I mean, okay, yeah, the quality isn't the greatest. I mean, what do you expect out of 1978? But you're hearing Eddie's voice, you're hearing your voice back in the day as well. I mean, it's the authenticity of it, it's just, you can't deny it. It's just fantastic to have that on record now. And the actual audio on the audiobook, I mean, this is unheard of, interviews from 40 years ago or longer. this
exactly.
Is archival footage,
Exactly. Yeah. And as you progress further in the book, Ed, you'll see that, the quality gets better because I was then using the Sony Walkman. So it does get better. Yeah. And the other thing was, I don't know of any other audiobook that has ever done this. Typically, there's a narrator and he will narrate all the parts. Whether it's with the musician or an actor or an athlete, you would never hear the actor or the baseball player, that audio embedded in those parts where it was his voice in a book, typically of an audio book, is derived from a book. So I thought that was pretty cool. I mean, I think that that's in its way is, a little groundbreaking and so.
And it's Eddie Van Halen. I mean, groundbreaking himself and what he's achieved. So on a guitarist level, on an artist level, musician level, historically, he's like he's probably the greatest. but each to their own. But it's without a doubt, like most people know who he is when you talk about guitarists. So I mean, just to have this footage from his very beginning is just, and that's what you're saying. It's groundbreaking. Like it really is, and unique. Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, man. I mean, I really think it is, and for a long, long time, I didn't want to release any of my audio, anything, any of the interviews I've ever done, but I thought, I was lucky. I was lucky to have met these people and sat down and I talked with them. And I thought there must be other people out there who would want to hear a Jimmy Page interview from 1977 or David Gilmour from back in the day, or, and that's what makes the interviews so interesting is that, because I've been writing for such a long time, that these interviews were done in the moment. They were done, in 78 and 79, and not an interview done with Edward in 95 talking about 78 or 79 or the first record. And there's value in that, but it's infinitely different than hearing Edward from back in the day. And so, I finally, came to that realization that, what, I think people would really, really like to hear this stuff. And I'm going to put it all in an audiobook, and the response to the book has been great. I think people are going to hear the audiobook and just flip out. And especially as you keep listening, Ed, you're going to hear these little musical moments, Edward noodling, stuff that hasn't been on my YouTube, because I put some of that stuff up there. I jam with Edward. You're going to hear me butchering it, and trying to sit there with the greatest guitar player in the world, trying not to, have a heart attack. But there's really some amazingly cool stuff. So, yeah.
Very exciting. So, Steve, can you now? Well, let's talk about Eddie. Because your book is. Let's focus on the book now, because of just how historical this is. So, can you explain your first meeting with Eddie Van Halen, and what were your first impressions of him?
1977, July. They have been signed by Warner Brothers, but the first record is not out yet. The first record won't come out until February 1978, the first Van Halen record. So I'm at the Whiskey, which I visited a lot. I was at the Whiskey a lot back in the day. So it's a Friday night. Cheap Trick is recording a live record. I thought, wow, Cheap Trick recording a live record with Whiskey. That's worth seeing. So I'm there with my brother, and we're standing downstairs. Michelle Meyer, who was the club's booker, there's a tap on my shoulder, and I turn around, and it's Michelle. And I knew Michelle. I played in bands back in the day, and she booked some other clubs around town, a club called Madam Wong's East and Madam Wong's West, which were two pretty hip clubs. And she booked my band into both clubs. We didn't have to audition, so I loved her. I would do anything for her. She said, listen, there's somebody you have to meet upstairs. If Michelle wanted you to meet somebody, you met this person because she knew everything that was going on in Hollywood. She really had her ear to the ground. She knew great bands, good bands, not so good bands. So she wanted you to meet somebody. You knew it was going to be somebody unbelievable. So we walk up the stairs to the Whiskey dressing rooms, and the Whiskey dressing rooms, man, are like standing in it looks like the bottom of a garbage can. I mean, they reek of cigarette smoke, man, and there's empty beer cups, and and there's writing, graffiti on the walls, but it's rock and roll, right? This is the Whiskey, 1977, the heart of the Sunset Strip. So I see this guy standing in the corner, and you have to understand that it's 77. There are no stories out on Van Halen. There are no articles. There aren't many photos of him. In fact, I don't know if there are any photos of him other than the flyers that they used to put up around town. I'm pretty sure that I recognized him. I keep going over my head. Did I recognize him? Did I not recognize him? I think I recognized him. I had never met him. And another thing, I had never heard Van Halen play, which was odd because they were playing the Whiskey and they were playing at the Starwood. And I was at those clubs a lot, but I had never seen him or heard him play. So we walk over. and he's smoking a cigarette. He would always be smoking a cigarette. So we walk over, and she goes, Eddie Van Halen, Steve Rosen. We shake hands. Steve Rosen, Eddie Van Halen, Godhead. And he smiles. Michelle calling you Godhead is the highest praise that she could give. If you're Godhead, you are on the top of Mount Olympus. You are a king among kings. You are the greatest there is. So we start talking, and you asked me, what were my first impressions of him? It was one of those conversations, and I describe it in the book as a conversation that it continued sometime earlier, and you were sort of continuing the conversation. Somehow we got into a dialogue about Eric Clapton. I was a huge Clapton fan. I loved Cream. I loved the Yardbirds. I loved him and John Mayall. I loved him in the Roosters, those early blues bands. I knew a lot about Eric Clapton. And when I would meet somebody and Clapton would come up, I was sort of a snub about it. So if I'm talking to you, Ed, and you made a comment like, Eric Clapton played that solo in the Cream song, right? The fact that you would have to even reference like that tells me that you don't know anything about Cream, and I would immediately dismiss you as, it's like the Wayne's World. You're not worthy of talking to me because you don't know enough to talk to me about Eric Clapton. I mean, I'm being a little silly, but so I didn't want Edward to say that, but I was thinking, God, I bet he doesn't know that much about Clapton. But Edward, the way he dived into Clapton was different than my understanding. Edward dived into his playing, and he's talking about his finger vibrato and the tone, and it's like, oh my God, this guy is like way deeper than me. I mean, I understood peripherally about Eric's tone and this and that, but not like Edward did. So I thought, oh my God, this is amazing, And then we start talking about Jeff Beck, who is another one of my favorite guitar players. And I think we might have brought up Richie Blackmore, who was another one of my favorite guitar players. So it was like this conversation that, there was never a lull. It was never the embarrassed silence. It was just amazing. I mean, honestly, I believe I could have talked to him all night. And I don't know if we talked for a half hour. It could have been an hour and a half. And at one point he goes, oh, I'll be right back. And he runs out of the room. I go, what's he doing, And he comes back and he's got a pencil or he's got a pen. And he picks up a scrap of paper off the floor and he's writing something and he hands it to me. And I can see it's his phone number. And he goes, hey, man, really enjoyed talking to you. Call me sometime. I go, yeah, that would be great, And so I leave. We go back downstairs, and Edward stays upstairs. And my impressions of him, he was self-effacing. He was humble. He was gregarious. He was outgoing. We talked about the Warner's deal. I knew that Van Halen had been signed to Warner's, and they were like the first of all the local bands to score a major deal with a major label. So them getting a deal on Warner Brothers, my God, that was unheard of. I mean, I would have cut off an arm to have just had a meeting with somebody at Warner Brothers, and here he had a deal. I remember asking him, you have a deal with Warner Brothers? He goes, yeah, it's pretty cool. He goes, I think we made a good record. I hope we do well. And that's who he was from the moment I met him. You never heard him say, yeah, man, that second record we did was great, man. And I smoked it. I am better than all those other guitar players. He never talked like that. There were guitar players that said some nasty things about him early on, and Edward never forgot that stuff because it was disrespectful. And with Edward, it was all about respect. So Ed would take a shot at them once in a while, but he was just an amazing guy. And I love being around him. And it was a difficult thing. One, I did become friends with him, and I believe that he respected me and trusted me. I respected him and trusted him. And beyond that, I had just the absolute awe and admiration for what he did. I mean, his artistry, and it was just, it was profound. I realized I was in the presence of somebody who was rewriting the guidebook for electric guitar. I mean, I knew that. I recognized that. And so we'd sit down to do an interview for a magazine, and I had to become Steve Rosen, the journalist, because I had a gig to do. I had to, extract this information from him in a professional way. But at the same time, as I'm talking to him, I had to keep telling myself, "You're talking with Eddie Van Halen. You're talking with Eddie Van Halen. Don't be a geek. Don't nerd out. Don't tell him he's the most amazing guitar player you've ever heard, man. Don't do that. Don't do that." And that was hard, because at every moment I wanted to say those things. Edward didn't like hearing those things. Somehow he thought it was demeaning to even say, "My God, Ed, what a great guitar solo." Not that he felt above and beyond it, but he knew he was a very good guitar player. You didn't need to tell him that. He needed you to be respectful in other ways. So yeah, man, it was amazing. I believe that we were very good friends for many years. He was amazing. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
incredible.
It's interesting when you said your Michelle friend, who he hadn't released an album yet, and she's calling him Godhead. That's got to tell you something, right?
It really does. It does, man. And honestly, I never really thought about it until now. Michelle worked at the Whiskey, so I'm guessing she had probably seen him play many, many times. Again, I had never seen him play. So, yeah, so I didn't know, but you're right. Her calling him Godhead was amazing. And let me just fast forward, and I'll kind of finish this story real quickly. So we fast forward 8 months. The first record comes out. I remember receiving it from Warner Brothers. I was on the list for all these labels, and they would send you the monthly releases. So I remember getting this record. I'm going, "Oh my God, that's Van Halen. That's Edward." And I look at the cover and I see him, the 4 pictures on the cover, and he's playing what I thought was a Strat, which I would soon come to realize was not a Strat, but a guitar that he had made, right? And I put on the record, and besides Michelle, every other person I'd ever met said, "Oh my God, you got to hear this Van Halen, Steve. This guy's the greatest guitar player you've ever heard." And they all knew I was writing for guitar magazines. I'd been writing for Guitar Player for about 5 years at that point. So they knew I had interviewed a lot of amazing guitar players. I was always kind of looking for the next great guitar player. And so I was expecting to be absolutely destroyed. I thought, my God, this is going to be like hearing the first Jeff Beck record, first Hendrix, first Zeppelin. This is going to be mind blowing. And I put it on, and it's the and I go, "Yeah, that's pretty cool." And I kind of listened, and I go, "Yeah, it's okay." And I kind of, did some record skips around, and I thought honestly, my first impression was, this sounds like Deep Purple, but it's not even done that well. There were like fast shuffles, and I thought, nobody does that like Purple. And I put the record away, and I was so disappointed because I wanted to be transported. And I thought about it. I go, I'm missing something. There's no way I can be sensing this. And every other person I know, journalists, friends, telling me that this is the greatest band, the greatest guitar playing they've heard. So the next day I sat down, the big cup of coffee. I drink a lot of coffee. And I sat down and I listened carefully. And I go, "Oh my God, that's what everybody was talking about. That's this guy. Oh my God, that's that guy I met. He was saying he was hoping he made a great record. This humble cat. My God, yeah, I got it, man. The tone and the phrasing and his approach to rhythm playing and the way he swung with his playing, which is an incredibly hard thing to do. Because a lot of guitar players, good guitar players, play straight up and down, man, and that rhythm thing doesn't bounce. It doesn't have that groove. He had that big time, and his solos and it was a live thing, and when he came to a solo, the rhythm would drop out, which I love. I love that approach, and I got it. And part of me maybe was happy that I didn't realize what an astonishingly great guitar player he was when I met him that first conversation. I just knew that, yeah, this is the guy that had a deal on Warner Brothers. He must be a good guitar player. And maybe that had something to do with that first conversation. So, yeah. So that's meeting Edward Van Halen and hearing that first record.
That's so interesting because no doubt, like, as a journalist, like, you were well into your career at that point, and
Yeah.
you're receiving music left, right, and center. To review and to obviously listen to in general, and so you'd have a very nuanced sort of critique of music, obviously, because there's so much. So, but maybe he was just a little left of center, and at first listen, you're just like, uh, not didn't meet your expectations, but like you said, you had a coffee, came back, and you listened to it again. It was just like, wow, this is special.
Right, right. No, man, you hit it on the head because yes, I was being inundated with music. I mean, yeah, albums were coming, and I was going to a lot of concerts, and I had interviewed. I mean, I'd interviewed some pretty amazing guitar players before I met Edward. In fact, right before I met him, I had just interviewed Jimmy Page. I'd gone on road with Zeppelin for 11 days. Like I said, Jeff Beck. I just interviewed Richie Blackmore, Joe Walsh, Ronnie Wood, John Entwistle, John McLaughlin, uh, Paul Kossoff. I mean, my heroes. I mean, guitar players that I love. But you call it a nuanced kind of a feeling that I had. That's a good word for it. Um, if I go back and listen to the music that I kind of grew up on, it was really that English rock. It was Jeff Beck and Page and Hendrix. So Hendrix is an American, but he made his fame in England. Pete Townsend, Robin Trower, and Paul Kossoff. Um, Gary Moore. It was all that English, 67, 68, 69. That's the stuff that I grew up listening to. I had seen Jeff Beck. I was just a kid, but I saw Jeff Beck with Rod Stewart. I saw The Who in 1966. I was 13 years old. I saw Cream. I saw Hendrix twice. So yeah, my expectations, my bar, man, it was high. And if you weren't freaking as great as that first Jeff Beck record, the Truth record, or Jimi Hendrix, Are You Experienced, or the first Zeppelin record, those early Procol Harum records, or the early Jethro Tull records, Martin Barr, who's an amazing guitar player. It's like it was hard for me to really sink my teeth into. And I think all of that, not consciously, but that's what was in my head. So when I heard that record, I thought, yeah, okay. Where does it stand amongst the records that I love? But then I tried to be a little more open and neutral. And like I said, the second day I heard it, I go, wow, this Edward Van Halen, yeah, man, this is as important an album as the first Zeppelin record or the first Jeff Beck record or that first Jimi Hendrix record. And indeed it was. I mean, I mean, he went on to, change electric guitar playing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Mm.
pretty amazing.
Well, I mean, so I didn't know you've seen Hendrix play. I mean,
Yeah.
that is a high bar because they're both widely considered. I'd have to say two of the goats, greatest all time. Obviously, Eddie took it to a technical level that Hendrix never did, but I believe that Hendrix, he really paved the way for pure craziness at any level on the guitar. Like, he opened everyone's minds, sexual revolution, all this stuff, 60s. Him also Clapton, but Hendrix with the whammy and just like, but Eddie took it to a whole new level, to a point where what we have today is more a result of Eddie than Hendrix. Would you say?
That's an interesting comment. I mean, I would say that, and I want to I want to comment on Jimmy in a second. And I think the reason why, look, I see these questions come up, on Quora. I don't know if you've ever seen Quora. The questions are so stupid and insipid. But it always comes up. Well, who's a better guitar player, Jimi Hendrix or Edward Van Halen, or who's a better guitar player, Eric Clapton or Jimmy Page? Well, the better guitar player is who is your favorite guitar player, right? I mean, you can't compare them. I think the reason that Edward is maybe more influential now than Jimmy, as you said, one, obviously he's a much more recent guitar player. Two, Edward actually grew up in the digital age. So Jimmy, it's still analog, it's pre-computer. So you were hearing about Jimi Hendrix by seeing him in concert, by reading in a magazine, by buying an album. With Edward, yes, there were the albums, but you're now seeing him on YouTube and on all the pages. The audience is now increased 10,000-fold, a millionfold. I think that had a lot to do with it. I think Jimmy, if you think what he did when he did it, I mean, that first record is what, 66, 67, 68? My God, I think those are like 8-track recordings, and the way he was able to orchestrate and layer his guitars, the fact that he also wrote, sang, and played everything. Edward doesn't sing. Edward didn't write lyrics. Jimmy did all of that. So they're different animals, to be sure. But yeah, both absolute game changers. Unbelievable. And it's funny because Edward has said, though I know that he listened to Jimmy, that Jimmy was not a particularly big influence on him. Sometimes Edward would say things, and then he'd sometimes rewrite his own history and say things. But I don't think you hear a little bit, to listen closely, you hear a little bit of Jimmy in Edward's playing, but not a lot. So maybe Jimmy wasn't a big influence on him.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the thing is, I mean, I see exactly what you're saying, but I'm not trying to put Eddie above Jimmy, because Jimmy in his own right, I mean, Spanish Castle Magic, that is heavy. That is probably at that time was the heaviest song ever.
Absolutely.
That opened the way up to metal, and so did Zeppelin. So the influence is unmatched. I mean, just to open up those sort of pathways, but definitely what Eddie did was anyone that's shredded in metal and through the 80s, or 70s or 80s up until now, has probably melded both of those together, the heaviness, Hendrix, and the gravitas and the skill level of Eddie, and it's just become this explosion. Like it's just pure skill that you're listening today. When you talk about metal, but any like guitar influencer now, I mean, I just want to say and just to make it clear that I'm not disrespecting either. I think I really respect them both, like what they have achieved and done for music, for guitarists.
Man, no, all valid points. Yeah, and Edward cast a long shadow, and you can certainly hear his playing in guitar players across all the genres, and we can't forget that Edward Van Halen built his own guitars, and more than that, played his own guitars, and those guitars sounded that way. I mean, that to me, if he had been a mediocre player who could only strum a few chords, and he made those guitars that sounded like that and had the ears, so it's like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Did he hear in what Edward would describe his own sound as the Brown sound? So did he hear that in his head, and he goes, I'm kind of hearing that in a Strat, but it needs some more balls, some more bottom end. So I'm going to put in the humbucker, and that's going to be the Brown sound. Or did he build a guitar and then kind of the sound, the Brown sound came after it? I write in the book, I can only think of 2 guitar players who built their own guitars and played their own guitars. And I could only think of 2, Les Paul and Brian May. And he would have relationships with both. I had the incredibly rare good fortune to actually introduce Edward to Les Paul. They were both being inducted at the Rock Walk Hall of Fame, the Guitar Center, the famous store on Hollywood Boulevard, where the guitar players put their hands in cement. Well, the inaugural induction was Edward, Les Paul, somebody from Ludwig Drums, uh, one of the Martins from Martin Guitars, and I was able to get the two of them together for an interview. I interviewed Les earlier, a couple of years earlier, and I obviously I knew Edward, and I got them both together, and we went up to a room upstairs, and they interviewed each other. But yeah, Les Paul and Brian May, built their own guitars and played them. Man, that's astonishing to me. I mean, look, there are a lot of guitar players who now have signature guitars, but it's a little different. Um, Slash may have been playing Les Pauls, and maybe he dropped in a couple different kinds of pickups, or rewired a toggle switch or something, and that's totally valid. And then Gibson may have made the Slash signature guitar, which is totally fine. But it's not as if Slash built that guitar from scratch. You know what I mean? So yeah, so Edward doing that, the way that he used the variac, and lower the voltage on the amps, and tweaking speakers and pickups. He had really amazing ears.
Yeah.
It's not sort of, it wasn't just by chance that Edward Van Halen was Edward Van Halen. Besides being that kind of having that technique, he had extraordinary ears, and he could hear things. He could hear a pickup needed to be rewound this way or that way. And so, there's a reason why he was one of a kind, it wasn't just kind of this random thing that happened. So,
Yeah, he's definitely was an innovator, like within his craft, like with his playing. He got down and dirty building those guitars to find the right sound that he needed, and that's it. Like he liked both the Les Paul and the Strat, and he just basically put them together. Like, but in a real but it took a lot of trial and error as well, from what I've read, as well. So just an innovator, and it really just goes to show that's just what made him so unique. And like what I wanted to say also, like with his ear being trained as well as it was, because I know he took classical piano lessons when he was younger, but he had a general like fundamentals of theory. But then he spent way more time in his room just discovering the guitar, over those years and that was it, like his ear. And then he very openly said, I don't read music, it's all in here. And so just an innovator of the highest class, paved the way.
I'm sorry, Ed. Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny. Again, I mentioned earlier that Ed would sometimes rewrite history. He did start off taking classical. He and Alex. Alex was also a very talented musician beyond drums. I think Alex played violin. I think Alex might have played sax. So I think Edward could read more than he let on. Look, if you put a complex piece of music in front of him, could he read it? The way a studio guy could? No. But I think he could get there, and he could, hammer out those chords, even the weird, extended chords, and he could do that. But yeah, with him, there were two constants with Edward every time I met him. He would have a cigarette in his hand, and he'd have a guitar. And literally, whenever I was up at his house, and he only lived about literally 8 or 9 minutes away from where I live. I had a little guest house in the Hollywood Hills, and Edward sort of lived a winding road in the next canyon over. He would always be sitting in the studio with a guitar in his hand. Always. And if he came over to the pad, first thing he did is he'd walk over, he'd light up a cigarette, walk over and pick up one of my guitars and play. So that's just who he was. That's what he did. People say, well, what do you think he would have done if he hadn't played guitar? I don't know, man. I do not know.
Because the guitar was everything. It was just him and guitar were just like married.
Yeah.
It was a very close relationship that he had with sound, with melody, and what he basically taught himself, really, wasn't it? And to the nth degree. I mean, it's just such a fascinating story, and such a wonderful role model for all guitarists, really, all musicians, or anyone that's really finding their way for in any craft. I mean, he really put in the hard work, and it just showed. It just came out so effortlessly once he reached that level of professionalism and popularity. I mean, you just saw it. It just eked out of him. You know, it just came out of his pores.
Absolutely, and you ask yourself, what was it about Edward that was so unique and special? And you've just, discussed very eloquently and all of his qualities. And yes, we know that he was a brilliant guitar player. There were other really, really good guitar players around when Edward was coming up. I always cite George Lynch, who's an incredibly good guitar player. My God, he's unique, man, and the way that he picks and his tone. Warren DeMartini is an incredible guitar player, right? His tones. There was a guy around town, Rusty Anderson. Rusty has been Paul McCartney's guitar player for many, many years. You can imagine how amazing he is if he's playing in Paul McCartney's band. He was incredible. So I've often thought, well, what was it about Edward? Was it the band? Was it the songs? I think it was something else. I think it was just internal things. Somehow people, and you touched on it, man, they were just touched by him. He had that rare thing, man. He just had this heart and soul. People just connected with that, and these other guitar players were amazing and they had huge followings, but there was just that one XY chromosome that they just didn't quite have that Edward had, that set him apart, and yeah, it's pretty amazing, man. And again, that's a thing that comes across, happens, once every generation. I mean, Jimi Hendrix. I mean, for me, it's Hendrix, it's Jeff Beck, it's Eddie. There's probably one or two other guys in there, but there aren't many where you just get that sense that that's all they do. That's what they do. They were born for the guitar, and there's a special thing. I mean, you really felt it with Jimmy. My God, he connected in a way that no other guitar player ever has. So, yeah, pretty remarkable.
Like from what you're saying, like, I mean, well, the thing with his music, which I feel from what I hear is there's a lot of joy in his playing, isn't there? In his riffage, in his the scales he uses, and then his smile, like it's so bright, it's so. I mean, obviously they took a more of a serious turn with Sammy, but that just opened up the musical, the musical boundaries that they had with David Lee Roth. I mean, it just because Sammy was way more musical than David, and which was in itself just amazing because like right now isn't the very happy song, I wouldn't say, but you know what I'm saying. But
Yeah.
But you're talking about his David stuff and even a lot of the Sammy stuff. There's a joy to it that I don't feel like. Maybe like George Lynch is more metal. I love George Lynch. I got to see him this year actually play, and he came to Australia. It was such an honor. But what I'm saying, and in his own right, he is so unique and talented in his own way. Not a copycat of Eddie at all. But Eddie had this joy, which I just think isn't really no other guitarist has really reached that. I don't know the heights that he reached in that sense. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, man, I get it. No, you're right. You're right. They were. I mean, joy is the perfect word. I mean, he was never happier than when he was playing guitar, and people connected with that. And you touched earlier on why he affected so many people, and all guitar players they get that. They go, my God, he sounds so joyful, and that's what he wants to be doing, and I want to have that, And you're right. A lot of that rock was, back then it was way more serious, and and the guitar players were kind of serious on stage, and it was all the histrionics, and I never felt quite authentic. And then it gets into the heavier stuff, and now it's all Dungeons and Dragons, and this kind of thing. But yeah, no, you're right. I mean, they were a happy band, and Dave's melodies and his lyrics. And you're right, Edward tended to solo over those kinds of scales, that were more, major sounding, hence more up sounding, and and his sense of harmony. I mean, his chord changes were amazing. I mean, Jump. I mean, it's unbelievable. I mean, it's infectious. It's and I think for him, it was never a conscious thing. Oh, I'm gonna be that kind of person. I'm not gonna be the Dungeons and Dragons guy. I'm not gonna write all this minor sounding dark stuff. That's just who he was. And that's what came out, and that's what people connected with.
Definitely. Yeah. Definitely, I believe that's one of the reasons why he connected, for sure. He definitely had a joyous mood and feel about his music that's just unmatched. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, so a bit more about Eddie. So from in terms of his guitar style, so from your conversations with Eddie over the years, what insights did he ever share to you about his unique guitar technique and style?
I have asked guitar players a similar question. I asked him, well, what are you thinking about when you played a solo? And I reference if there was Joe Perry, an Aerosmith solo, with Edward, I don't know, some solo of Fair Warning. And guitar players can never answer that question. And what insights, they tend not to. They understand intellectually, and Ed could tell me, yeah, man, it's it's the A and the sus and and I this scale, but emotionally or what set him apart, he was never able to put that into words. And I asked him, those kinds of questions, because I thought, Ed, how is it that you are you, and those guys can never answer those questions. It's always up to somebody like you or me or the fan to try to figure those things out. I mean, I wish I had sat down and he said, and maybe there's some in the book, maybe it's a little difficult to remember, where he goes, well, it's, I try to do this and this and this. He would always say, man, it's like falling down the stairs, It's like, yeah, man, I'll fall down the stairs and I'll land on my feet and I'll come up with something. With him, mistakes were a big thing. He'll do something and it would have been a mistake. And he goes, man, I love that because I could never duplicate it again. So that was part of that thinking, I don't think he took a lot of tries at a solo. I think they came fairly quickly. Some stuff he sat there and he structured. And you can hear those parts. Fair Warning is where it gets, excuse me, a little deeper. Right, there's more guitar parts. I think the solos are much more structured, and I think he took more time with them. But no, there was never like any, oh my God, Ed, that's how you look at it. That's how you think of it, I mean, again, I think people read the book, they'll get more of an overall sense of that, but I can't remember any specific questions where it was like, oh my God, yeah, that's what it was, Because again, he talks about Eric Clapton as an influence. And he talked about Eric a lot. I mean, you really have to listen closely to hear any Eric Clapton in his playing. So even stuff that he said he was influenced by, it's hard to hear. So I don't know, man. That's a tough question to answer.
What other influences did he ever cite to you as his main influences, and what effect did that ever really have in his playing other than Clapton?
It's funny. Because Jeff Beck was and Jeff Beck is my favorite guitar player, Edward's probably my third or fourth favorite guitar player. I think Edward was the most influential guitar player who ever lived. I think Jeff Beck was the greatest guitar player who ever lived. And I think Jimmy was the greatest at orchestrating guitars and putting all that together. Anyway, that being said, uh, I did ask Edward about Jeff Beck, and he goes, I really didn't listen to him that much, and I was astonished by that. He said, yeah, man, I kind of heard Blow by Blow, and I kind of liked that, but I didn't listen to him that much. I mentioned earlier that I think Edward could maybe rewrite history. Look, I could be totally wrong. I think Edward listened a fair amount to Jeff. But again, did you hear it in the playing? It's difficult. Maybe some of the changes, again, Jeff wasn't a writer, but some of the changes, maybe were reminiscent of some Jeff Beck stuff. Who are some other guitar players that he would talk about? Alan Holdsworth. I mean, it's, Alan did all of that unbelievable legato, those huge stretches. I remember once we had a conversation and I had brought up Alan Holdsworth because Edward was supposed to have produced Alan's record, which never happened. Alan got a little anxious and wanted to do the record, and Edward was on the road, and he went ahead and did the record, which was a mistake. I think had Edward done that record, Alan's career would have had a completely different art. That's just my feeling. But I did ask him about Alan. And it's funny, we were sitting down on the couch and we were talking, and Ed started trying to emulate Alan, doing those big kind of, Alan would he had a way to pick where you couldn't hear the note picked. And Ed was trying to do that, with these huge stretches, And Edward said to me, he goes, well, man, I've been sitting down recently because I haven't been on the road. Normally I would practice standing up and I could play that stuff, but I'm sitting down and I can't really play it. And here's a little tip for everybody. You're going to hear that in the audio book, and you're going to freak out when you hear this. Edward Van Halen saying that he can't play like Alan Holdsworth. It's amazing. Almost as if he was like making an excuse, which was like, that's the beauty of the guy. Edward Van Halen making an excuse to me that because he hadn't been practicing standing up, he couldn't play those Alan Holdsworth stretches. I mean, to me, that says everything about the guy. You know what I mean? But in answer to your question, he mentioned Holdsworth. I know that he was a big fan of Cactus and Jim McCarty. Cactus used to do those fast shuffles. He loved Leslie West. And you can hear some of that in his playing, though Leslie obviously never played that quickly, that fast, He never really talked about a lot of guitar players. The thing with Edward was, back in the day, in the cover days, they had like a repertoire of 200 songs. So he was doing songs by Black Sabbath, so he was learning the Tony Iommi stuff, and ZZ Top, so he's learning the Billy Gibbons stuff, and Cream, so he's getting the Clapton stuff down. Purple, the Blackmore stuff. He was doing funk stuff, so he was learning that funky James Brown stuff. Spirit, Randy California. So I think it just kind of all came together in this, guitar player that we called Edward Van Halen.
So what about? I have to say this because I'm Australian. I know he was very fond of AC/DC, right? Because they were on the Bills together, like in the early days. From what I've read, his song from 1984, "Drop Dead Legs," which is one of my favorite Van Halen riffs. He was influenced by Back in Black from that. So I mean, like what? I mean, what is? Did he ever mention anything about AC/DC to you?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of quick AC/DC anecdotal moments here. So it's July '78. Van Halen are playing Day on the Green. This is the first show away from them opening on that Journey tour. So it was Van Halen, Montrose, and Journey. Journey was kind of not letting them do sound checks, wouldn't allow them to use all their gear, their flash pots, blah, blah, blah. they were invited to do the Day on the Green show, which are those shows that the promoter Bill Graham put on in Oakland, where he'd bring together pretty amazing bands, 6, 7, 8 bands for one day at Oakland Coliseum. On this particular day, it was AC/DC opening. I think this was their first tour. So they were kind of nobody at that point. AC/DC, Van Halen, Pat Travers, Aerosmith, and Foreigner. I was there to interview Foreigner, Mick Jones, for a guitar player. I knew that Van Halen were playing. Make a long story short, I go backstage and I see Edward and we say hello, we hang out. I wanted to see Van Halen play that day. AC/DC were over. I was going to go walk outside, out to the front and watch AC/DC play. AC/DC's publicist saw me and said, "Hey, do you want to interview AC/DC?" Now, this is going to get me in a lot of trouble here. I hope the Australians
but
don't
okay.
worry about me. I was never an AC/DC fan. You know, hey man, their career is astonishing. They're on the road again. They are legends. They're one of the biggest selling bands of all time. More power to them. I was just never an AC/DC fan. So when I was approached to do the interview, it was like, oh, I'd really rather go see Van Halen. But I knew the publicist, and she had set up interviews with me, during my career. I thought, okay, I'll go back and interview AC/DC. So I'm sitting there with Angus. I didn't know anything about AC/DC. I mean, I knew a little bit, but I didn't have like any interview planned. So I'm asking him about some stuff, guitar players and things. And a guy comes over. We're sitting at a picnic table. There was like these picnic tables in the back, the compound backstage. This guy comes over and jumps on the top of the picnic table, and he's drinking, and he is fucked up. And I'm waiting for Angus to say something to the guy, like, "Hey, man, we're doing an interview. Can you leave?" I'm waiting for the publicist to come over and tell us got to leave. And I'm about 3 seconds away. I said, "Dude, could you please leave? I'm trying to interview Angus Young here, And he jumps off. I didn't say that. He jumps off the picnic table, and he sits down next to Angus. And Angus goes on talking like nothing's going on. I'm going, what the fuck? Why isn't he saying something? And then this guy reaches out his hand. He goes, "Hi, mate. My name's Bon Scott." I go, "Oh, my God. I must tell Bon Scott to fuck off." He turned out to be a very, very sweet guy, man. Really nice guy. So that's my Bon Scott. That's my AC/DC story. Edward had just come up with a lick that was on 5150, and it's in the book. You're going to freak out, Australians, when you hear this. He loved AC/DC. He loved Bon Scott. He wanted a singer like Bon Scott. That's what he wanted. He did. And he came up with this riff, and he goes, "Yeah, man, it's like, and forgive me, everybody, again, I can't think of the song, and I'm going to be shocked, but when you see it, you're going to go, oh, yes, that song." And Edward starts singing the lyric, and he's playing it. And he goes, "Yeah, man, listen to that lyric. That's the kind of lyric I want to hear." And it was an amazing lyric. And forgive me, I can't remember what it was, but Ed was a huge AC/DC fan. And I asked him, there was another comment later, years later after that 78 show with AC/DC opening. I go, "Man, what was that like? Were you nervous?" He said, "Going on after AC/DC? Are you kidding me?" I was terrified. So yeah, he had big respect for those guys. He loved those guys. Yeah, I think in his way, he kind of saw. I mean, maybe he kind of wanted Van Halen as maybe I don't know, a little more kind of an up, maybe not as heavy as AC/DC kind of a band. I mean, he would love to have had Bon Scott as a singer. Which would have been interesting to be sure, right? So. But yeah, had mad respect for AC/DC for sure.
That's so cool to hear that, like, and look, they did the hard work just like Van Halen did themselves.
Yeah, they did
in the clubs and everything. So I mean, like, you can see where that respect came from, and they just wrote some banging tunes. Like, I mean, yeah. I know you're
No,
not the
no.
greatest one of them, but
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, but the respect is there. Obviously, like you've stated, like it's just that mutual respect was definitely there. So yeah, that's pretty cool.
Oh yeah. Look, man. I shook you all night long. Look, I'm not stupid. Man, those are great songs. You know, just overall, I've just never been like an AC/DC guy. But hey, man, I get it. Those songs
Yeah.
are unbelievable, man. They're anthems. They'll live on for the next 100 years, man.
And
Um,
look, I'm not a huge Jeff Beck fan. I know he's your favorite guitarist, but I have utmost respect for him. I mean, like and what he's achieved and just his technique was just he's the guitarist. He's
yeah,
widely known as that. So yeah, I totally get you. And we all got our own loves and likes and stuff.
yeah.
But just to hear that as an Australian, it's pretty cool. And I knew as soon as you said this guy gets off of the table, start drinking, I knew it was gonna be Bond. I just knew you were gonna say that. That's hilarious. That was so funny. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. Just real quick about Jeff Beck. When Jeff Beck passed, it's all of a sudden all these guitar players who I think never really, I mean, look, they liked him, but they never poured out the accolades like they did when he passed away. And I'm not saying everybody did that, but that happens a lot. A musician will pass away, and all of a sudden, oh, I loved him. He was my favorite guitar player. And that bothers me, you know. But anyway, that's
Yeah.
just my quirk. And the fact that you don't like Jeff Beck just tells me that you really don't know much about music at all, Ed. So I'm kidding. Listen, I got it, because Jeff went a different way, man. He got fed up with lead singers, right? Rod Stewart, and he had a couple other singers along the way. Didn't want to do it, so he pursues an all instrumental career, which is going to have a limited audience, and they're typically probably going to be mainly guitar players. And if your only fans are guitar players, you're never going to be huge like AC/DC or Van Halen. But that's what he did, But
Yeah, I respect
yeah,
that. I did buy blow by blow in my early days of playing guitar, but generally it's not that I don't like Jeff Beck. It's more he just wasn't even on my radar as much. Like,
yeah,
and I know he was more in the '60s and '70s. You know, being a part of that British sort of movement of
yeah,
rock and roll and blues rock and hard rock or whatever, and he just obviously went into his own path and it just wasn't even in my radar because a lot of the music I listened to was just my parents' vinyls. So I was listening to my mom was listening to the disco, 70s, 80s disco, Quincy Jones produced stuff, with the Toto Boys and all those session music. I'm reading the liner notes. So is that, and then my dad has had all Dio and Rainbow, Deep Purple, AC/DC, and Van Halen. So it's just it wasn't even on my radar. And I wish I could have been had and I didn't really get to know as much about him until he actually passed away, which is just brutally
uh,
being, yeah. But I'm a
yeah,
huge fan. I mean, obviously, yeah, for what he's achieved, it's just amazing. Yeah.
yeah. He was pretty amazing. I mean, those first two records. I mean, the Rod Stewart records, Truth and Beckola. To me, it's like, yeah, every band after them kind of copied that format. The singer out front, and but to each his own.
Yeah, yeah. No, but without a doubt, one of the most influential guitarists ever in his own
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
and he deserves the respect. Okay, I've got a couple of more questions for you, Steve. Thank you for your time again. I'm really enjoying this conversation. It's very fun.
Great.
So you've written very extensively, obviously, about Eddie Van Halen. What do you believe is probably the most misunderstood aspect of his life and his career?
I just sort of had this conversation, a similar conversation with somebody else today. The fact that he was he was a really fragile person in many ways, and we see him on stage and the smile and the way he walks on stage and the records, there's so much power and there's so much majesty in what he does, and he he had he had everything you'd ever want in this world. You know, the beautiful life and the house and the guitars and the fame. And underneath it all, man, he was a human being. And for me to write about that was really difficult because I didn't know how people were going to react to that. What do you mean Edward was, got sometimes sad or depressed about things? That's not Edward. That he's never sad. And I thought, do I write those things? Do I write about those moments? I mean, I think that's maybe one of the most misunderstood things, that he did have those kinds of concerns and problems in life that everybody else has. Problems with the band. The band was at odds with each other. Problems with the label. Problems with the marriage. He loved his dad, and you'll hear this in the book. It is heartbreaking, his dad passing, and hurt him just like would anybody's father. I mean, I think that's one of the huge misconceptions about him. He was egoless. Like I said, you never heard him toot his own horn. He never talked about a record. Oh, that's the greatest record we made. We'll never be able to top that. Or, a performance on the road. He never talked like that. I don't know. It's a tough question because I tried to answer that question in the book, and it took me 580 pages to kind of, to understand Edward. Understanding Edward, it was not an easy thing to do, and hopefully I got part of it right after 580 pages. But yeah, I just think that he was, underneath it all, he was really a human being. And he made mistakes, and I think from reading the book, I think everybody understood that, I think they, not that they like to hear that he had problems, but I think that makes them have a better understanding of who he was, and why in my mind, it made his music even more amazing,
Yeah.
in ways. So
Yeah. Thank you for that insight. I mean, that's it. He's human, just like the rest of us. And that's what it comes down to in the end. We all got emotions. He does too. He's not just MTV glowing smile. He's a human, just like the rest of us. So it's very, very nice to hear your insight, knowing him and being his friend firsthand. So yeah, thanks for that. I've got just one question. This just came up in my mind when you were just talking about that. So it's not even really kind of related. I just want to know, what is your, as a journalist, obviously you're critiquing albums. So what is your sort of view on Van Halen 3 with Gary Sharon? And it's different from everything else. It's just different.
In the same way that I sort of dismissed the first record on first listen, everybody kind of dismisses that record. I liked it. I thought Gary was a really good singer. I mean, in his way, I mean, he was as good a singer as Dave or Sammy. I mean, I thought, that extreme stuff, man, there's some good stuff in there. I
actually got to see them a few months ago. They came to Australia with Living Colour.
Okay.
I mean, he's just a phenomenal showman as well.
Yeah.
And the tour that Van Halen did with him, there's video out there of that, and he's just so entertaining to watch as well. But as you were saying, like with the album, so he did Van Halen 3, obviously. So what are sort of your views on that? I liked
it. Yeah, I liked his lyrics. Man, I thought they were different. I thought the songs were different. Look, Ed's guitar tone. It was a little. What's the word? It was a little homogeneous. I'm sorry?
Not as acrobatic.
Yeah. Homogeneous, exactly. It was a little, it wasn't, it touched on the Brown sound here and there, but you're making comparisons to the first record, the second record. My God, 1984. Yeah, man, it just didn't happen. And I know that Edward had a bigger hand in the production, right? I don't think the label supported it at all. I don't think they were happy with Gary. Look, this is just stuff I've heard. Edward never said those things to me. But I think all of those pieces going together, talk about, Edward being a human being. I think all that stuff hurt him, because now he's really taken more of the reins, and, I think he kind of handpicked Gary, and the record just didn't do that well. I mean, it did. Any other band would have loved to have had, whatever that record did, but, compared to those earlier records, I thought it was a good record. I'm afraid to say that for the same reason I'm afraid to tell anybody, even though I write about it, that I thought the first record was mediocre, because everybody else says, oh, that record sucked, it was horrible, I just think it basically came down to, we were willing, when I say we, the Van Halen nation, was willing to accept Van Halen with a second singer, so Sammy, and because again, Edward's music had changed, there was a lot more keyboard centric. Sammy was a much more musical person than Dave, as you mentioned. And, he was a guitar player. He had a bigger range. Edward was able to write to accommodate his range. So the music was different. Had it been sort of a duplication of what Ed had done with Dave, I mean, I think it would have been, a disaster. But it did go in a different direction. And, it was hugely successful. But no one was willing to accept the third singer in Van Halen. It could have been Bon Scott. It could have been Freddie Mercury. I mean, you know what I'm saying. I don't think they were willing to accept that. I don't think the label was either. Those are my feelings. But I thought it was a good record.
Yeah, because as we know, it was panned like globally.
Yeah.
That album. But I believe there's some definite highlights on that album, but I don't think the world was ready to accept a very sensitive and minor key.
Yeah, you're
Eddie
right.
Van Halen.
Yeah, and wasn't there was there an instrumental on that record?
I think there were. I can't remember the name. It was,
yeah,
it's an acoustic. Wasn't it an acoustic track? Was it?
I think so.
Yeah, I can't recall the name.
Yeah, I don't think people were willing, even though obviously Edward had done, Spanish Fly, but that was different.
Mm-hmm.
This was like straight up acoustic.
Yeah.
But,
so I just thought it'd be interesting just to see what your thoughts were on that, considering how badly it did obviously on the charts, but
yeah,
it holds a special place in a lot of Eddie Van Halen fans' hearts. That's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he loved Gary. He loved Nuno. Like those guys were tight. Yeah.
They were.
Mm.
Yeah, he had big respect for Nuno. Nuno loved Edward too. Sure.
Yeah.
You there, Ed? I played the Bumblebee. Edward came over to the house. I think I played that once or twice. And I'm trying to see if I actually played any of the EVH, any of the PV guitars later on. I may have played one somewhere. They picked one up at a Guitar Center, or I don't know, maybe an AM show somewhere. But the thing about Edward's guitars is that people think, oh, they played unbelievably easily. They didn't, at least for me. The action wasn't real low, and his vibrato bar, because it didn't float, and you only had to, you had to push down on it. And I think he used, and again, I could be getting this wrong. I think he used like 4 springs. He may have used 5 springs. So man, it really took some pressure to get used to that. So his guitars were a challenge to play, at least for me anyway.
Yeah, it's just interesting insight. And also just a quick, just quickly in regards to Sammy, it's probably his farewell tour coming up, and he's got Satch and Jason Bonham and gang playing. So do you reckon you'll catch one of those gigs? Because I'm in Australia. I'm going to miss it. What do you reckon you'll catch a gig?
Yeah, I'd love to see one of those gigs. I'm pretty sure they're playing around here. I'm in kind of in Orange County. I'm near Disneyland, so I would imagine they're probably playing somewhere. If not down here, I'm sure they're playing up in LA somewhere. So yeah, I'd
Yeah.
love to see that show. And you know, Joe was an early supporter of the book. Joe actually did like a little video for me, and I think we talked about Joe doing the Highway Sentinel solo. He's just remarkable. It's funny because I heard some people talking. I think the first time that they shot anything with the band, they were doing Howard Stern. It was an early morning thing, and I don't even know if they'd rehearsed yet, but it was kind of early morning, and people saying, "Oh, Joe Satriani, he doesn't even play those songs right. He can't play Van Halen stuff." And I remember putting a post. I go, anybody who says that, you just don't even have clue one. This guy can play anything. He's gonna pay homage to those guitar parts, but he's gonna also make them his own. I mean, you're gonna know it's Joe Satriani playing Van Halen songs. And now everybody's going, "Oh my God, Joe, you're amazing, you're amazing." It's like, wake up, people. I mean, come on, Joe Satriani, are you kidding me? I mean, there's a reason that Sammy chose Joe Satriani, right? I mean, he could have. Look, he could have picked any guitar player he wanted, right? Who wouldn't have wanted that gig? So yeah, I'm sure it's going to be unbelievable. I'd love to see the show for sure.
Yeah, I know, because there was some that criticism. Obviously, he played it maybe that the song differently, the solo, but
Yeah.
But I mean, just think, like, he also paved the way for a lot of guitarists as well himself. I mean, he is an innovator in a similar vein. Obviously, Eddie opened up the floodgates, but he took it to a whole nother level in terms of instrumentals and telling it. I mean, maybe in a more advanced way than Beck, because Beck sort of was already doing that kind of thing. But especially when we're talking about the '80s and like just the glitz and the glamour of all that, like he was really in that, and so I think he deserves way more. He deserved way more respect than what he got with that. And obviously, he's not going to be a copycat of Eddie. Like, we don't want that. Like, we want to see Joe, and they're there to pay tribute, like you said. So, yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Joe opened the doors for a lot of people. I mean, there's a couple of guys that were kind of leading that spearhead. I mean, it was Joe and Steve Vai. I mean, there's a bunch of other great guitar players, but those two guys really, sort of created that style, whatever that is, fusion, rock, instrumental, But Joe's really a rock guy at heart. I mean, he was a big Van Halen fan, loved Hendrix, I know he's a big Clapton fan. I mean, he loved all that stuff, and he was in Deep Purple for a while, and there he really got hammered. "Oh, you're not Richie Blackmore." Well, nobody's Richie Blackmore. So in some respects, that may have been, well, I don't know. But certainly that was a difficult spot to step into. You know what I mean? Yeah, Joe's amazing.
Yeah, even when he was the Mick Jagger's guitarist in I think it was the late '80s. I mean, he didn't. He was paid full respect. I mean, Mick Jagger it's his show, but he just fit in there seamlessly, and he played like more bluesy sort of rock. He wasn't trying to out shred everyone, did he? But even though we knew what he could do, but it was just he's phenomenal. He can play everything, like you said. So yeah, and he's a rock guy. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, that's good. So their shows, I'm looking forward to seeing some footage of that as well. Okay, so the last question, in regards to your career, I mean, and also being a close friend of Eddie Van Halen, how has that affected your life personally and professionally, since being such a close friend of his?
I look back on that, and there are times when I think that it never even happened, because it was such a surreal experience, and just meeting him on that random night at the Whiskey. And I think about that. Well, what if I hadn't have gone to the Whiskey that night to see Cheap Trick? Would our paths have crossed like that? And what if I had met him after the first record came out? Would that have changed that dynamic? So, I don't know if I'm a big believer in destiny. I kind of believe you kind of, make your own way in this world. But I mean, it was pretty odd that, I would have been there that night and he would have been there. But in a more direct response to your question, Ed, um, when I was writing the book, um, I I knew that it was going to be an important book. I mean, I wanted to write absolutely the best book I possibly could, and by that I mean I wanted to be the best writer I could possibly be. So I think while I was working on the book, and I was still doing journalism at that time, I was still doing interviews and stuff. I mean, I think I sort of got into the mode of, um, I mean, really trying to elevate my game, if you will. I mean, look, man, every time I sat down to write a story, or every time I interviewed somebody, I, I was there 100%, and I was going to try to write the best story I could. But I think just being in that routine of waking up, sort of early morning, 2 or 3 in the morning, waking up, writing for 5 or 6 hours. I mean, that was like really disciplined. I never tended to work that way. If I had a story to do, not that I would work right up against the deadline, but I would rarely write for that many hours in a day. Probably write for maybe a couple hours a day and let it go and come back. So it also got me into that mode of being more disciplined. Um, I think after the book came out, I think that maybe people looked at me maybe a little differently. That I had written this book on arguably the best guitar player who's ever lived. And while Steve Rosen hung out with this guy and he knew him, and he wrote this book, and now maybe people see me as a music journalist in maybe a little brighter light, which was great. I mean, I hope that happened. Edward was unfailingly positive. I mean, I would be around the guy, and he was never down for no reason. I mean, if he was down, it was because something had happened with the band, and there had been some commotion, with Dave or something, or maybe he was upset with Mike. But it's not like he was just like a moody guy. Like I'd go over there, and because it was a Wednesday, he'd be in a blue mood. He was just never like that. So being around him, it was like, it was like this amazing drug. He was just so good for my soul, and he was always so supportive of everything I did. And like I said, we'd play guitars once in a while, and he'd make positive comments. If I was feeling kind of blue, he would try to buoy my spirits. Say, "Hey, man, it's okay," and he would talk about me as a journalist. And, he goes, "Man, that's cool. You've done all that stuff and interviewed all those people." And I mean, he didn't have to say that stuff, but I love being around the guy, and I think he felt comfortable being around me. And, friends, you have to lean on each other once in a while. He was also really honest, so if I was up at 5150 and he wanted to work, he'd say, "Hey, man, I'm going to work now," and I was gone. I never wanted to impinge on that real estate. I mean, that was all his, right? But it's not like he said, "Oh, I'm going to work now, leave." It wasn't nasty, but it was like, "I'm going to work now." And usually I could tell he was, he'd be maybe a little distant, and so a lot of times I just leave. I mean, I knew, So yeah, it was an amazing experience. I mean, I don't want to give the book away. Over time, people changed. Maybe I changed. Edward went through some different things in his life, but I really try and hold on to those first probably 10 or 12 years was pretty amazing. I mean, look, there were amazing parts after that. But like I said, things changed, and it wasn't the same. But yeah, man, I look back on it as an amazing experience. And it's funny because people read the book, and some people come away saying, "My God, you really love the guy," and other people come away thinking, "Well, the book is kind of dark, and you talk about things," and they they see this completely different side, which I kind of love really, because that's what it was. I mean, it wasn't all amazing. There were extraordinary parts. There were some challenging parts, just like in any friendship. Excuse me. And yeah, man, I was lucky to have been there at the right time, at the right place, and yeah, I wouldn't have changed that for anything. It was certainly a high water mark, both in my life, as a human being and as a music journalist.
Yes, definitely. You're very fortunate to have to spend so much time with him and being as influential as he is. And you through the book, you've given us so much insight and sort of with all these unreleased material and a real look into him in the moment of his greatness, that no one has ever seen. So that's why this book is so great, everyone. Tonechaser, get your hands on it. Hard copy, like Steve said earlier. Contact him if you want a copy. Do you want to plug? Go for it. Tell us about how we can get a copy of the book and the audio book.
Right. So if you're in Australia now, just give me a shout. You can send me a letter, send me a note at tonechaserbook.com. That's where you can order the book. But I don't make the books available on the site internationally. But we'll figure it out. So just if you're interested in the book, give me a shout there, and I will get back to you immediately. Tonechaserbook.com. And we were speaking earlier, Ed. I just came out with the audiobook version, and the audiobook version, as we talked about, is embedded with all of those unbelievably rare and archival interviews that I did with Edward, some of them dating back to 1978. So it's really amazing. I mean, I keep listening to bits and go, wow, that really is unbelievable, So you can find the audiobook on mysoundwise.com. One word, mysoundwise.com. And if you've already purchased the hardback, you get the audiobook for reduced price. And if you want the audiobook and the hardback, go and buy the audiobook. And then we'll figure out how to get you the hardback for a reduced price. And yeah, so this is the variation. So yeah, so tonechaserbook.com or mysoundwise.com. And we'll take care of you.
Sure. And there's benefits of both, isn't there? Because you've got a lot of your own personal images and stuff, haven't you, on the hardback?
Yeah. I try to look. It's not like a photo-centric book. I mean, there aren't like hundreds of pages of photos, but I have expanded the photo section for this third edition, and I tried to find photos that were unpublished, and all the photos in that book are unpublished. Now, that doesn't mean that they haven't been circulated, and maybe you've seen them on somebody's Van Halen site or some fan put them up. There's kind of no getting around that. But there's some amazing photos in there. I tried to pick photos of Edward playing guitars that you don't normally see. There's an incredible shot of Edward playing the Les Paul. And in the book, there's an amazing story about when Edward had just bought these two pristine Les Pauls, and he brought them over to my house. And he plays them, and you're going to hear him playing a Les Paul through my Marshall Jack to 10 in the book. To me, it's worth the price of the whole book. You just will not even believe it, especially since I'm describing the situation and he's standing there in my living room. And these pictures, if you could see the pictures behind me, you can. They're shaking off the wall. I mean, it's amazing. You will love that stuff. So there's a bunch of amazing stuff there. And yeah, a lot of amazing stuff. Edward playing guitars and me jamming with Edward that I think you guys are really going to flip out over.
Yep. Thank you so much, Steve. And for your time, for allowing me to talk to you about this as well. We're very excited for this book. I love it. I'm 8 chapters in, and I'm hooked. So,
Nice.
Thank you. As a guitarist, as a musician, it's and because knowing his influence, like Eddie's influence, is just, it means so much to me, and I'm sure the whole guitar community globally as well. So thank you for that.
Really appreciate that, Ed. I appreciate you having me on and all your interest, and everybody out there watching this. This guy here is a very good guy, and we had to go through 10,000 different ways of trying to get us hooked up, and we finally made it. So I think it's all been worth it. Yeah. So
Okay.
you guys
Yeah.
be good, and cheers, and all you guys down under, and you be well.
Thank you, Steve. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Okay. See you, bud.
Goodbye.
Bye.